All right, so today's lesson is going to be programming analysis. For those of you who didn't join one of the previous ones, all the materials we're running for these lessons is going to be the free lessons that are on our website. If you go to alice.org and you go to Alice 3 lessons, you will see this page. And the second one in the getting started is the programming analysis one. Going to that page, you will see something that looks like this. All of the materials we're going to go over are going to be at the bottom of the download section will be the Google links. Those are the ones I'll be using. If you need to download to your computer to print or things like that, you can access the other ones here. I said this in a previous one and wanted to reiterate that we do want you to feel that you can edit them and shuffle them as you like. So feel free to take those Google documents and copy them to your drive and then make whatever's will make it more relevant to your class, add other materials, things like that. You'll see a little bit of an overview there as we go in. Things you can point yourself or your students to would be these how-tos. So we tried to link all of the relevant how-tos that will be covered in the lesson below, and then also the exercises and projects that we're going to go over and that are included in the facilitation guide are also on this page. So it's sort of a one-stop shop for everything for the lesson. The facilitation guides walk through a number of things, including the learning objectives for the lesson, a couple different ways for, outlining what skills you'll learn by going through the lesson or should expect to know by the end of it, a full list of vocabulary that you can bone yourself up on or use for assessments and things like that. And then there's a number of different ways to run through the lesson that include talking points to go with the slides, talking points and ways to run the facilitation of the exercises. So there's also then a PowerPoint presentation that's sort of the heart of the lesson. Similar to the scene editor, we have a couple assessment options, just the terms that you could use, some longer form questions, a quick match just to make sure that catching all the different components of the code editor, which is what we'll be covering today. If you wanted to, I printed these out. Again, it'll be a little bit of a challenge to have the exercise handout open and then full screen Alice. So if you have the ability to print out the handout for the step-by-steps for the exercises, that can be a good thing just to free up some screen real estate. In these, we'll sort of walk you step-by-step through a bunch of things as we go. With that, I am going to dive into the presentation and just start teaching away. So programming analysis. This is another point where, if you're learning this as just a design tool or a way to create cool animations in games, you can skip past all of this and just get into the skills building. If you're teaching computer science using this, there's a couple slides in here that are intentional around that. There's other things that could be included as well. But the first part is just, does everybody know what a computer program is? So when we talk about that, we define a computer program as a set of instructions or statements that tells a device what to do. Broadly, a device, just because of the sort of nature of technology these days. Programmers generally write computer programs using programming languages, which then can be translated to machine code that can be executed by the device. So when we talk about that, I mean, the machine code being sort of the binary ones and zeros, programming languages make that just more accessible and have constructs around it. So one thing we like to point out is that, lots of people have heard of, Java, things like that, quote unquote programming languages. Alice is just as much a programming language as that because it is using an abstraction to allow you to create that binary code. The basic concepts of programming are really these sort of 5 building blocks. So you have a program can be a list of instructions, so just a sequence of doing things. It can be directions to do something if something else happens, so conditional execution. So if it's not just going linear, it's sort of a if else, we'll get into that. It can be instructions to repeat a behavior over and over again. Looping, computers don't get tired, so they're really good for doing things over and over again. It can be a set of directions that returns an answer to a question, so that's where it actually does some thinking. A function. A program can be a mixture of all of the above. So a lot of programming is just really creative uses of those 4 different building blocks. So in Alice, we're going to sort of get into all of those different ways to program, and then all of the creative outputs of a game or an animation or virtual reality or things like that is just going to be some mashup of using those in interesting ways. So what is an Alice program? So an Alice program is sort of made of, well, can solve a problem such as creating a scripted animation or story. It can create an interactive narrative or open world. You can use an Alice program to create a game with win and lose conditions, the ability to sort of track interactions in the world. It's sort of made up of 3 different sets of types of programming. So the first one is your scene editing or scene building. So as you're building that scene, you're actually creating code that is telling the computer how to set up that environment. The next part would be sort of sequential programming or other things, and that is where you're sort of telling the world what to do. So, you know, move left, move right, those types of things. There's also event programming, which allows you to do things like ask for key inputs from the user or mouse interactions and things like that. So those are sort of the 3 major parts of an Alice program. What does it look like? What should happen? And then should we be listening for any inputs from the user? The code editor looks like this. There's a couple major components of that editor as we look at it. So you have the camera view in the top left. This tells you, sort of gives you a window into the scene and is where the camera is situated when you're going to start running your program. There's the methods panel. So the methods panel in the bottom left is where you will find the sort of code blocks. So Alice is a block-based coding environment. So if you've done things in Scratch or Blockly or any number of these sort of early computer science tools that are visual programming languages, the concept of a code snippet that can be dragged in. We have the editor part. This is where you will write your code and build your program. And then the control panel on the bottom is another place where you'll find blocks for coding and things like that. So that, in addition to the methods panel, is where you'll grab all of the things that you need to write your program. The camera view, like I said, shows the starting view. So when you're going to run your program, you can actually drag things around in there. We definitely recommend that you go over to the scene editor when you want to do those types of things, because that's just such a small window. The major components that we want you to pay attention to would be, we talked about this last week, the setup scene button will allow you to jump over to the scene setup, and then the edit code on that side will allow you to jump back. The run button is the big one. This is where you'll sort of run your program from. We love to say that Alice is an iterative program, so you should not be afraid of that button and should run your program as often as you like to see what you're constructing. The methods panel is where you're going to find the code blocks that are dragged into the editor. Alice is a object-oriented coding environment, so it's, I mean, that essentially says that most of our code is going to be written on an object in the world. So in this example, you see the Mad Hatter and you see the procedures underneath that are specific for having the Mad Hatter do things. That's the purple tab. Functions we talked about are ways to return information. That would be the green tab next to that. So you can sort of jump back and forth between that. We'll go a little more in depth in that in a second. The code editor is where you will build your Alice program. So here's a little bigger version of, it can be navigated to in multiple ways. There is the drop-down menu in the top left, so where you see the yellow hexagon, which will allow you to access different classes and things like that we will get into later. And then this is the sort of tabbed folder navigation method where you can click on the little tabs at the top of the code editor to be able to select between what you see here is scene, initialize event listeners, my first method, and the Mad Hatter. So selecting on those. The differences of those tabs are, there's 3 different ones. So the my first method is where you will build your main program. So that allows you to drag in those procedures and things like that. There's the event listeners tab. So we'll get into that a little bit later of, you know, setting up your computer to listen for inputs or things that will start when your program starts, those types of things. It functions a little bit different. These are things to pay attention to. If you find yourself on that, you will not be able to drag the basic methods in there. So that's one indicator if things are going wrong. And then the yellow ones indicate a class. So this is where you'll find a summary of information around classes. So when we talked about this last week, there's sort of biped as a class, those types of things. So it's the information about those classes. Again, we'll return to all of this. Just wanted to show that those exist, and that, you know, if it's not doing what you want, the majority of the work today that we're going to do is going to be on the My First Methods tab. The control panel is found at the bottom of that code editor section. And this is where we're going to get into things where you allow it to do different programming patterns and things like that. So it has blocks that you can drag in there, like as you see on the bottom, do together, for each, in, count, while. These are the loops for repeating. You see the one on the far right that's for comments, and some things around being able to use variables. We'll again go more in depth in those. So what is a method in Alice? So a method in general is just a small defined set of code within your program that gives instructions to do something. So for Alice, these are obviously things that are related to animating objects is a predominant one. So if you look at the one on the right, we've created a little bit of a method that is jumping jack. And if you look down that, it sort of has move up, down, left shoulder, right shoulder. So imagining what a jumping jack would look like, you can see the code that would go with that. There are two types of methods in Alice. So procedural, which is the purple tab, and functional, which is the green tab. So going back to those concepts of computer programming, the procedures are the telling something to do something, and the functions are the returning information. So again, if we think about them in terms of a 3D world where we're trying to animate, the ones on the left, you see a lot of move, turn, roll, those types of things that we talked about in the scene, say, think. If you look at the green one and imagining that we have this 3D world, the kind of information we might want to ask from the computer would be, you know, how far away is this object from another object? That's the kind of data that the computer can tell us about our world. There's some other ones in there that you see, get string from user. So again, there's some built-in ones for asking the user for information. Those are the types of functions that they're most commonly used in Alice. We have a bunch of them that we have created for you already in the built-in procedures. So like I said, these are the move, turns, and rolls, says and thinks. There is more code underlying that, obviously, but these are ones that are created just to allow you to do those types of things. We also have some, depending on the object that you select, some things like changing the fog, adding sound, some lighting and things like that. Like I was saying, Alice is object-oriented. So the same way on the scene editor where you had this component here that you could drop down to select your objects for moving them around in the scene, is the same sort of functionality that allows you to select the object that you want to program. So in this one, we have a couple objects added to the scene, so you can select from those. So then what is a code statement in Alice? Code statements in Alice are the code that actually allows something to happen. They have built-in parameters. So this is the part where Alice wants you to not make broken code. So a good example that we have is, you know, the Mad Hatter moves. Well, if I just put in a code statement that said the Mad Hatter moves, the computer is not going to guess at which direction or how far. So just the statement alone of the Mad Hatter move is not going to be executable by the computer. You're going to have to tell it which direction and how far. And so you see these cascading windows here that we will force you to fill in parameters, which is, you know, arguments to that move that will allow us to then execute your program. Like I said, these are the required ones that allow us to actually have something that can execute. We also have optional parameters that we can sort of plug in some defaults in that. For most of our Alice statements, we just sort of put a default that this will happen over a 1 second period of time. There's some other things that you might want to modify after that we can execute the program without you changing, but are really helpful for creating, you know, more rich dynamic worlds. As you see here, there's the scene by, duration, and animation style. The duration, like I said, will default to 1 second, but maybe you want something to take longer, be faster, so you're going to want to change that one. The animation style, we'll go a little bit into that later, but everything in Alice sort of smooths itself out, so it'll start slow, get up to speed, and slow down. There's begin and end abruptly, some things in there that allow you to change the behavior of the objects as they execute these. And then the as seen by will allow you for directions and things like that to choose, is it from the perspective of the object that I'm talking about, the camera. So a little bit more advanced. To add a procedure in, you select the object, similar to the scene editor. You can obviously program all of those joints. So if you wanted to move just the playing card's neck or something like that, look for a caret next to an object. And if you wanted to select a subjoint, that's how you access it, the same way that you did on the scene editor. Creating a statement. So to start to write your program, all you need to do is drag that statement into this my first method, select something for the required parameters, and then you'll have created your statement. The next part of that is once you've created even one line of code, you can press that run button and it will open up this player right here. The player has a couple things on it that allows you to pause it, speed it up, restart it. This is a great place to stop if you're doing this in a class, or we're going to do it together right now. We have a simple exercise and project that can be found at the bottom of that lesson that is called Hello World. For everybody who has never programmed before, there's a little bit of the history of Hello World. So just like there was a first programming language, there was in programming, there was the first person that had to teach programming. There's a little history here of going back to Bell Laboratories and the idea that a simple program that showed that you were actually running something that could give feedback to show that your program worked was to print on the screen, Hello World. This is continued on in the history of programming to be something that the Hello World, to show that you have figured out and actually been able to write a program for a new platform. Obviously for things like Alexa that don't have a screen, your Hello World might be to have Alexa say Hello World. And so these things have modified as technology has changed, but it is a good way to just do the very basics of and sort of enter yourself into the stretching history of computer programming and learning programming. So then what does a Hello World look like for Alice? We're gonna jump over to Alice. Here's my Mad Hatter. It's important, I'd like to have everybody think about this, that this will be their first time programming. It's going to shape your future when you become a famous Bill Gates-like programmer. Thinking back to where you got your start, if it was Alice, this will be a penultimate moment. So again, think about where you want it to happen.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you get to that screen with like the world already? Do I just click on the blank slate, grass?
Yeah, so I just went back. So here, let me start from the beginning with this to catch everybody up. If you open Alice, you'll come to a screen that looks like this. And then you're going to want to choose where your first Alice program is going to go down, this historic moment. I'm going to choose the C floor. When we come to the C floor, this is the code editor. So we just talked a little bit about this one, and we'll come back to in a second. If you didn't join us for last week's lesson on the scene editor, definitely go back and give that one a watch or sort of look through the lesson. But the way that you get over to the scene editor is this setup scene in the top left corner. So I'm going to click on that to jump over to here. And now we're in the scene editor component. For this one, you just need a place and one character to make your Alice Hello World. And so I am going to choose something that lives underwater. We'll do it with a manatee. Again, if you don't recall from the last lesson, you can either drag and drop it in or you can double click it. So here's our manatee. I'm going to face him to the computer. All right, so now you should have a location, a character in that location, and then we're going to click on this edit code button on the bottom right. So there we go with that. Now we are into the code editor. So quick review of what we just covered is here is our my first method. This is where you're going to write your program. Like I said, there's the initialize event listeners. You'll see it looks a little different. It's going to function a little different. So when we move forward, you can't do what I'm talking about. Just make sure you have the right tab selected on top. I'll quickly show you what the scene one looks like. So the scene as a class, the properties that are sort of important to it or what is in the scene. So you'll see as you add objects, they're going to show up down here. You can also navigate to a bunch of these things through this. It's not going to be as critical now, but as we get into deeper lessons, we'll start playing around with things in there. So now we're back on my first method. So if everybody has followed along, you should have a location, you should have a character in the location, and then you want to jump back to this scene right here. You'll see that, you know, you can select whichever object. It will by default select that first object that you added. So I'm going to pick the manatee. So now we have our manatee. You see on the top of the list, you see say and think. So if you drag this statement in, this is where I'm sort of adding it to my first method, drag and drop it over there. The parameter for a say statement is going to be obviously what the character says. So you'll see that there's a default hello because we won't let you create broken code and have an empty one there. There's also custom text string. So if I select custom text string, another pop-up will show up where I can write my own value. So if you want at this point to do the traditional first program in a new programming language, you would do hello, comma, world. If you want to give it a modern twist, you might write something like, what's up? So whatever you would like to do there, just remembering this is a historic moment. So I'm going to do the hello world, collect hello world. You should now see in my first method, manatee say the string that you put in there. And then if everybody has gotten to that point, I can't really see what everybody's doing. I'm going to continue on, assuming we made it that far. Does anybody have any questions or get lost up to this point that they want to interject really quickly? All right, then we will continue on. So now we're going to use the run button. So in the top left, you see the camera view that we talked about, and you see the run button. If I press this run button, the run window will show up, and there it was. Humanity said hello world. If you are first time programming, congratulations, you just created a computer program. This will be the moment that you can look back on and tell everybody where you got your start. There's quickly showing the add details. For a say statement, we have lots of things for like the text style, font colors, those types of things. We're gonna look at duration. That one happened pretty fast. I can change it to a different number here or custom decimal number to put it in. When we talk about text, I usually like to tell people that one of the things in animation and stuff like that is to say it out loud and count it. So if I say, hello world, 2 to 3 seconds is the natural length that it would take me to say it. So that's probably how long somebody needs to actually read it. So we'll just go ahead and put 3 seconds in there. You'll see that it added the duration to this. So now our statement has a little bit more information. And now when I run the world a little bit longer, I was able to read it. And so there you go. That is the hello world exercise that is in there. That is one that it's a good idea. Some of these early lessons are a little bit long. To break it up, stop right about now in this sort of lesson and jump over and do that just so everybody can sort of get their feet wet with Alice. Hopefully nobody saw this when they ran that very simple program, but we can't always guarantee that we stop you from making broken code, and then sometimes things you will change we just can't keep up with, and then we will try to tell you through one of these errors that you might see that will pop up that there is something wrong in your program and point you at it. We will do things like turn stuff red. So in this case, maybe I created this, but then I deleted the playing card from my world. And so now we can't run that code because the character doesn't actually exist in your world anymore. There is another one that is an angry queen. I will also be honest that sometimes Alice just doesn't do a good job and we crash. That's on our fault. We're trying to fix bugs all the time. But if you see the angry queen, definitely let us know what you were doing and we'll try to fix bugs in Alice itself. So then control structures. Control structures are ways that you can modify that sequential programming to give it things that allow different things to happen. So Alice, by default, you'll see the little do in order that should have been in the top left of your my first method. That means that we will run these in order sequentially. So that's sort of first programming concept, unless you tell us differently. So this is much like a recipe where it's just do this, then this, and keep on going down the line. In Alice, obviously, you're probably going to want multiple things to be happening at the same time. If it was an animation where it was just one person walked over and then the other person had to walk over and then nothing could be happening in the environment, it wouldn't feel like a very rich environment. So one of the things that we have for you is a do together block. This allows you to put other statements inside of it. So in this case, card 2 will do a jumping jack while card 5 touches his toes. So it's ways to have multiple things happen at the same time. This is a very useful code block that we see a lot of people using in Alice. That being said, you might even want to go further and have something happening at the same time that are two different sequences going. So in this example that we have on the left side of the screen, we have a playing card that is moving up and down. So that playing card is jumping. And then we have the Mad Hatter moving up and down. So the Mad Hatter is jumping. Well, we want both of them to jump at the same time. So we put it in a do together. If we put all of that in the do together, if we could all do this together, I would say, what do you all think is going to happen? A lot of times people will say that, it will move up and then it will move down. They will both jump. What will really happen is you will see nothing because of the do together, the moving up of the playing card and the moving down are being processed simultaneously. And so while it is running your code, visually you see nothing. This is a challenge that, doing do togethers and doing orders is something that we mess up all the time, even though we've been using Alice a lot of times. So if you run your program and you're confident your code was all there, but nothing happens, come in and just take a look at what you were doing with do togethers and do and orders, because you might just need to put it in another do and order because the things are actually offsetting each other. Editing your code, just like in the scene editor, you can use Command and Control Z and Y to undo and redo. You can get that from the edit screen as well. So don't be afraid to do things. You can always undo them. And then if you realize that you really wanted it, you can put it back. When you're looking at that object list and you're creating your statements, if you drag something in and you realize you forgot to change the object before you brought in the statement that you wanted, all of the little components of the statement do have little carets next to it that allow you to modify it. So you can, I dragged it in from the playing card and realized I wanted to be the Mad Hatter. You can simply just reach over here and swap out the object that you wanted to do it. It will only allow you to swap out objects that are able to do. So the scene doesn't show up here, others don't because they can't move. Similarly, if it was something to set the fog, you would not be able to select one of the characters in your scene. The same goes for the direction of the move, durations and things like that, is you can edit them using those little carets after the fact. Reordering is just as simple as dragging them up and down the list. So if I wanted to reorder them moving up and down, you can just do that by dragging them around the scene. To delete a statement, you drag it back where it came from. This will bring up a trash can. There is also this right-click method to get to delete. I will say that somebody pointed out the other day that possibly our most recent release, for some reason, cropped this. So while you can do it, you won't see delete because it'll just be at the very bottom. We will obviously fix that, but you can always just drag it back to the trash can of the method panel. Cutting and pasting. So if you want something to happen, there's multiple different ways you can. This is more relevant when we get into dragging code from one method to another. There's a little clipboard up in the top. So drag it up to the clipboard, you'll see a yellow piece of paper show up, and that means something has been saved in there. You can cut and paste that way. Copying, this is only really possible through a hotkey. This is one that is super helpful. So it is Option click on Mac and Option click on PC. If I hold down Option when I drag a statement down, it will duplicate it. For something like this where the Mad Hatter moves up, down, 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 up, down, you could just drag in one and then Option click and drag down copies of it and then modify the parameters that you wanted, or if you wanted the same, different characters to do the same exact thing. So that Option click copying is really helpful. Disabling code as you get into longer ones and you want to figure out whether you want something to happen, not happen, if that's what's breaking your program, you can right click on any of the procedures and you'll see this is enabled. Unclicking it will disable it. Sort of the backslash in programming, if you put it before a statement, it essentially tells the computer to ignore it. So that's graphically what we've put over it. But if it's grayed out like this, then when you run your program, it's not going to be executed. There are a couple other tips and tricks in there. I mean, those procedures that we put in there that are built-in procedures are really to help you do a lot of things in animation that might take a lot of time to, you know, finesse either the move or the slight turn to and those types of things. So look in that procedure list and explore the sort of move to. So you see the Mad Hatter moving to the bunny, turning to face the Mad Hatter, turning to look at the bunny if you want them to orient to the same direction. So just play around with that list, get familiar with it. The camera that we put in and the camera marker that we taught you in scene editing, this is a great way to make really cool animations and to make things far more dynamic, is actually animating that camera. So we'll go through this again. I'll show an example of this as we get into this. Remembering from the scene one, at the bottom of your properties panel on the scene editor is the ability to add a camera marker. Once you add a camera marker, it can actually then show up in the target list for things like move and orient to. So it becomes sort of an object, that little piece of tape on the ground. If you use the move and orient to, it will include the rotation. I'll show an example later of if you just use the move to, it'll ignore the turn. So that can be ways that it shows up oddly. But don't forget that, you know, animating the camera is a great way to do a bunch of things. In the scene effects, you can see the fog. So this is one where the fog has been cranked up. Setting atmosphere color, setting fog density are great things to do. We'll talk a little bit later about how that can be used for multiple scenes. So if you want to change the scene, you know, fade to black, bring everything back up, change all of the ground textures and things like that. Sound is another great one to use in Alice programs. So there's a play audio. You can do things like putting it on scene activated if you want it to play in the background and not affect the order of your program. Put that in a loop so it'll just keep playing. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the event side of programming in Alice. Here you can see play audio. Obviously on a desktop, where you put it, so the play audio will show up on scene, it'll show up on characters. It won't have a lot of impact because it's just going to come out of your computer speakers. If you decide to use Alice to program for VR, the audio will actually come from the object that you assign it to. So that's something to think about if you're going to do this and run your world in VR, is the location of where the sound is coming from. Again, the run button, don't be afraid of it. We are all about incremental development in Alice, and this is the best way to not write too much and then find out that you messed up early on in the process. Just write a little bit, press that run button. The whole idea behind Alice was to cut down on that time to compile code and then find out things weren't working so you could test whether something was cool or not. So the whole concept is add a little bit, run it, change it as needed, and keep moving forward. I will remind everybody about the same thing I said on the scene editor, is save often. When you start your program, we will do incremental backups, but only after you save the first time. So be sure to save often. If you get to a point where you have something that you like, do incremental saves, so rename it as something else if you want to diverge. Next, we are going to move on to this tutorial. So this is going to be basic programming. It's called Houston, we have a problem. This is the scene that we are going to use. On some of these, just to save you time, there is a starter world that you can download. So if you want to run this one right now, you can either build this scene yourself, which I'm going to do, or you can use the starter world, or I guess maybe I'll use the starter world just to jump us ahead in time. So that will download you the actual file. And then again, here are some more how-tos. This is what the tutorial will look like. When we get in here, you know, we like to set up each exercise with what we're trying to do. Next week, if you come and join us, we're going to talk about, and I'm going to pause for 1 second and see if the sawing in the background stops. So we'll set up the story. And so here's the story, and the idea is that if there was a script for what we're about to create, there would be the exterior moon surface. An astronaut is out for a spacewalk in front of the Space Lab complex, and the alien slowly descends upon the astronaut and begins to wiggle his many legs. So We'll talk about it next week. We love pre-production, following in animation and game design and things like that, is always sort of have an idea of what you're doing before you build it. So most of our exercise will show what we would have done. So here's our story. If you're more of a storyboard person, here is a quick drawing of it with some notes on the bottom of this is on the moon's surface. It really can just be stick figures. We're going to talk a little bit more about the scene setup and why there's a little arrow there. Then the pre-production on setting up the scene, you see the little dotted lines that go around this. This is the camera view. When we think about what the scene will actually look like, it's going to have all of these bigger components. In Alice, you can't add objects to the world after you've started programming or running your program. So if you want things to come into the scene, we talk about it being sort of the theater stage where people are off stage left, off stage right. In this case, the alien that you see coming into the scene is going to start above the scene, so you don't see it because the camera view is going to be this, but we need the alien to exist in the world for him to be able to enter the scene. There are other things you can play around with opacity, putting people under the floor. There's lots of tips and tricks that we have around that. So we are going to come along here. If you wanted to follow along, start Alice if you haven't already opened it, navigate the file system. If you want to build it from scratch just to test out your scene building skills, here's sort of a quick run through of like who we need and what we need. So file, if I do open, you can do, blank slate, starter worlds, they're not there. My projects is where things recent, if you have recently opened it, file system browse will bring you to here. I'm gonna see if I can jump to Houston. We have a problem. You see the world. I'm going to go to the setup scene side. This one actually is not the one that we distribute because I believe the one we distribute has a starting camera marker. So a good thing to have. If I back out, now that I have that one, you can see here's the alien off scene. So some things you can do for that one. Undo, moving our back to the camera is if I have the robot, so here's our scene edit. One thing we like to do is if you know you want your object to come to a specific spot in the scene, work your way backwards. So I am going to move down 10. Oh, that was more than I wanted it to do. Move down maybe 2. There it is. So here's maybe where I want my alien to end up. So I build the scene around where everybody's going to end up. And then I can use the one shot procedure to move the alien up 2. And now I know that if I move him that far using code, where he's going to end up in the scene. So that is sort of one thing that you can do is if you know how you want the scene to be composed at the end, there's a bunch of other things that we can teach you as we move forward for using functions and things like that, and some code that's going to make that a lot easier to direct them without having to know exact positioning like that. Has everybody who wants to follow along made it this far, followed what we're doing thus far? Any questions before I move on?
Where did you get the astronaut from?
I just downloaded the starter world, right?
Yep.
Okay. And then do we have to add a camera or?
Well, you can tell me. If you go and click the scene button, I'm pretty sure I set this up. Come to the scene editor. If you look on your properties panel on the right and you open up camera marker, if you have a starting camera marker, I think I updated that starter world to have a starting camera marker. If you don't, you might want to add one in.
Okay, I'll add one.
And there was another question about where to find the alien, or I'm sorry,
the astronaut and alien.
So this is our gallery. So again, if you're just joining us this week, I highly recommend going back and watching the scene setup lesson that's on YouTube from last week, because it's going to go through a whole bunch of this stuff. But here is the gallery, and then the Sims assets are these first ones where we have a elder, adult, teen, child, toddler. So if you go to the new adult, you have all of these choices down here. And so the astronaut suit is one option at the bottom. So I can do that and then add the astronaut. So there's a new astronaut. You can drag around, use these things again. Definitely go back and check out all the intricacies of how to use a scene editor from there. We don't have an astronaut helmet, just as an FYI. There's a couple objects in our prop category that we can use, or make a sphere and sort of locate it over the head, or just imagine that this moon has air. For finding the alien, you can navigate this a number of different ways. I think the alien might be a quadruped. So there it is. You can also search the gallery. So if you're running any of these exercises and projects and it's telling you to build a scene or it's telling you to add a character and you just can't find it, you can do search and come back with what you need. So then we get into the planning your program. So we've added this in. We had previously waited until after the next one, but really there's those pre-productions where I showed you the script, showed you the storyboard, things that we'd love for you to do before you start coding, just so you know what you're doing. It saves you a lot of time for later. The starter world that you got, I think I also put the comments in, but if I jump over to the presentation, here's the comments. So it's a good idea to put these in. Again, they have the backslashes, so the program, the computer's going to ignore them, but it helps you to write your code. It helps people looking at your code to know what you were trying to do. And this one will just sort of tell you the orders that we're thinking about doing it. So if you were going to be adding your own comments in, that's this little guy in the bottom. So adding a comment in for this, the alien moves down into the scene. So now I know what I'm trying to code first. Jumping on to number 10, if you're following along on the exercise and projects. Again, this is sort of broken up, so this is a good point to check and just make sure everybody has built their world and is in there at the end of each of these sections. So we have animate the alien robot entering the scene. So again, going back to you select the object that you want to animate using this little drop down. So if I choose the alien robot, I now have procedures for the alien robot. So alien robot move. I just checked this starter world, which might be an older version. So if you're doing the one that you downloaded, I think there's potentially a different drop down at the distance of 0.25. We'll try that, down 0.25. Again, the goal of Alice is run often and see if it's working. So I'm gonna go ahead and run it just because I don't think that's the right distance for mine. Didn't come onto the scene, gonna change it to 2. Now if I run the program, there's the alien. Next up, if I had commented my whole program before, there would be one here that says astronaut, say Houston, we have a problem. If you don't know that story, then I suggest going and reading about Apollo. But so now we want to have the astronaut say something. So again, switch the object that's going to be animating. I'm going to leave it on alien robot just to show you how you can edit. So if the alien robot says, again, remember from the hello world, hello would be the default, but we want to be able to write what we want. So we are going to select this one. And we're going to say, Houston, we have a problem. Again, speaking it out loud, if I want to change the duration, it would be Houston, we have a problem somewhere in the range of 5 seconds. So I'm going to change the duration to 5, might be a little long. And then I am not going to, but I suggest you save. It's also a good idea to save your project, especially if you've done a bunch of work before you press run. If something on our part is going to fail or you wrote broken code that is going to catastrophically crash Alice, it may happen when you press that run button. So if you've got a bunch of stuff you just did and you want to make sure you save it. All right, so now if I run this world, comes down and the alien says, Houston, we have a problem, which isn't what I meant to do, but I can come back and edit the alien robot and turn it to the adult person. So I can choose either of the astronauts. And now when I run it, there we go. All right, check-in time. How's everybody doing? Did you make it that far?
Yep, I got it.
Will you get the duration?
Yep. So when we were going through the little lesson, talked about the optional parameters. So they're the ones that we don't force you to fill in. They're going to show up a bunch of different places in Alice. In a statement, they're going to show up as this add detail. So these are the only ones that are relevant to like move. Like we saw the one we were doing a hello world, that obviously when we're doing a say, you get different parameter options you can add. You're going to see add details as a little drop down in a bunch of different places you go around Alice. And so that's just something to check out because there might be things that you want to play around with. I guess quickly, I will demonstrate you can restart from here. So if you want to watch it over and over again, you don't have to close that run world window. Another thing that will happen is we used to have it where this would always sit in front your run window. Challenge was if Alice locked up, you would be sort of stuck and have to restart your whole computer. If I minimize this window, we can do a lot in Alice, but we can't let you edit the code of a program that is actively running. So if you're on the code editor or on the scene editor, well, I guess you'll only be on the code editor, and you can't do anything, so it feels locked up, look for in the camera window. If it says rendering disabled for performance considerations, we should really change that text because that's confusing. It just means your program is running somewhere. So go find your own window. When I close this, we'll get the camera view back, and now I can edit my code again. So take a look at that one. All right, the next section, 13, 14, 15, runs you through those parts that we just talked about. So changing the duration, messing around with the distance if you needed to, running obviously. So now let's talk about how we actually program subjoints. So while this is a riveting animation, it'd be cooler if the alien robot was a little more menacing. So just like on the scene editor side, if I want to get to a joint, remember to look for a little caret. So obviously that bunker doesn't have any joints in it. The boulder doesn't have any joints in it. So all the ones that have a little caret next to it have a joint in it. So alien robot, if I grab back left knee, so here's back left knee, you'll see that it's selected up here. And you'll have most of the same, but not all of the same procedures that were available for for the object and things like that. I'm going to, like we were talking about on the scene editor side, when you move joints in a person or an animal or things like that, you generally don't move the actual joint. You turn or roll the joint leading up to it. So going back to the example of waving your arm, you're really turning the shoulder, turning the knee, or turning the elbow, and turning the wrist. So same thing applies for here. I'm going to do get back left knee, turn. I'm going to go backwards, 0.125. We'll go bigger as an example. All right. And now if I run my program, comes in, Houston, we have a problem. And then you will see, well, 5 seconds feels long. It actually spun a little too far, which is why we put in the 0.25. But again, run your program, see what you like. You can always modify these things. So I can come back and edit this to 0.25. I think now we sort of let you run loose. You can grab whichever legs you want. You can experiment with other subparts just to give the alien a little bit of a wiggle. In the interest of time, I am going to jump ahead to the next section, but definitely circle back and do whatever you'd like from that one. I am going to add a back right knee wiggle just quickly so we have two things to work with. So back right knee or front right knee, doesn't matter. Do a turn forward, 0.25. So now if I run this program, I'm going to shorten this duration for purposes of playback speed. Comes in, one leg goes, then the next leg goes. Going back to our control structures, we have the option to use the do together. So if I drag a do together block from the control structures in the bottom, you'll see it comes in and you have a drop statement here. Whatever you put in there is then going to run at the same time. So if I put the left knee and the right knee in there, Now when I run my program, you'll see that they both move. So if you want to nest those things, do different things, have the left knees go together, going back to the example of putting a do and order inside a do together, I can do a do and order inside the do together. I'm going to drag the back left knee. Remember that a really great thing in Alice is the option click to copy. So I just press down option to duplicate. I'll do it again here. So option down. Now I have the right knee moving forward twice. If I do forward and then backward, it's going to return to the same part. So backward and then forward. I'll show you the do together. So we're running out of time, but would ask everybody to predict what's going to happen. It's a good way to do assessments for this is create some programs and ask people to guess what's going to happen. I'm going to run that one again. So you see one leg moves and the other one doesn't. I mean, the other one actually processed the code, but since it was moving up and back at the same time, because it was in the do together, nothing happened. So again, I would sort of drag in the do and order and then add both of these back into it. And now we have front right knee, left knee. Now if I run this, it should have both of them going together. So play around with that. You can get all kinds of sort of variation in the leg wiggles and which ones are running at the same time. The last thing, I guess, any questions on that before I move on to the last segment of the exercise?
Just a quick question.
Yep.
How did you duplicate again?
Yeah, so a good one to learn. So the option key on your keyboard, press that down and hold it, and then click and drag. And you'll want to do it to somewhere where you'll see it come in. So sometimes if you drop it, it might not always go. But you can do that over and over again. So I could do, you know, backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, forward. One thing that I guess I'll also call out just because of this, remember that these are all duration of 1 second. So for it to do this right here would take 5 seconds because it'd be 1 second for that one, 1 second for that one, 1 second for that one. And so this one's only going to run for 2 seconds. So they will happen at the same time, but this one's going to keep playing for 5 seconds while this one only runs for 2 seconds before it moves on to whatever is next. Using a little bit of math, I could do it so that this one then becomes 2.5 and this one becomes 2.5, so that this do in order will take 5 seconds to match this one's 5 seconds, so that when I run it, backward, forward, backward, this one should be forward, and then this one would be backwards. If I run this program now, that one's going to move a little bit slower, but both of those things should end around the same time. Any other questions on this before I move on? All right. So I love doing this, and definitely if you're going to start programming for VR, things like that, or if you want to create a ride or those types of things, or just change scenes, stuff that we'll definitely cover in next week's for multiple scenes if you want to craft that, is that come back to your scene editor. We should have this starting camera marker. If you don't, make sure you make that one now. I'm going to move this camera up. And so here we are. We've got a little close-up of our two astronauts. I'm going to add another camera marker, and I'm going to call this one close-up camera. So there we go with a close-up camera. Remember that wherever you leave the camera is where your program is going to start. You can tell this by if I go back to the code side, that's what I see in the camera pane. So that's not where I want the program to start. So come back here, select start camera marker, and then move my camera back. You'll now see in the scene your other camera marker as a sort of ghosted object. So now if I come to the code side, we have the alien coming down. I'm going to move the wiggling to go right after he comes down. And then we have Houston, we have a problem. So before that, I want the close-up to happen. So again, the camera is just an object like all the other ones, so I can select it from the drop-down. I'm going to go down here and say there's the move and orient twos. There's also the orient to and move to. I'll show you an example of why you want to use move and orient to. So move to, you'll see that my close-up camera is on the list. If I now run my program, Alien comes down, wiggles some legs very menacingly, and then we use the camera marker. But since I didn't use the orient to, it didn't take that turn. So it's not really where I want it to be. I'm gonna, again, remembering how to delete stuff. Here's the move to, like I said, my version, delete is cropped off the bottom. I can get to it there, or I can drag this guy out. Now I want to use the move and orient to. So if we do move and orient to, and I do the close-up camera, now when I run my program, Alien menaces, and then camera zooms in for drama, and then Houston, we have a problem. That making sense to everybody? See the benefits of using the little camera direction markers and moving the camera around?
How do we set the the starting camera as the start? So like when you run the program, it'll start with the starting camera instead of the close-up camera.
Yeah, so it is always going to just start where your camera is in the world. So even though there are these two markers, if I bring my camera all the way back here and just point it out into nowhere, if I come back to my code side, you'll see that's the view. When I run my program, that's where it's going to run from. So it's not so much those markers that determine where your program is going to run from, it's actually where the camera is. So once you've set up that starting camera marker, you're always going to want to, before you come back and write code or before you run your program, make sure that you select it from the camera marker options. There's the camera moves to the camera marker as the left button. So you see the black camera, which is the icon for the actual camera. The red one, which is color coded based on the camera marker. So this one would be green. If I wanted to move my starting camera to here because I was nudging the camera, I would use the right one. But in this case, I want to put my camera in the starting camera position. So I'm going to use the left one. And so now when I come to the edit code side, we'll see that that is the view that I see, and that is where it's going to run. Did that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Cool, you got it. All right, I mean, that is pretty much the basics of using the Alice programming side, the code editor. So a little bit about what are all the different components. It's a very simple one for creating an animation. So be in my first method. If you wander out of there, come back to there. A quick overview is it calls my first method when you press the play button, which is why this is where your code starts. This won't always be the case as we get into some other ways to approach writing your program. Remember the do together and the do in orders. We're going to go into more of these control structures in later weeks. Check your object, use the built-ins, get creative with the add details, and definitely use some camera moves to add some interest curve and excitement. That about wraps it up for this week.
Can I use a camera marker from, let's say, the right side?
Yeah.
Make a new one?
Yeah, these ones, remember, are just for checking your layout.
Oh.
They are not used in code. So I guess this is the only thing that would break that, in that I am looking at the layout scene view, but it's really just for orienting my scene if I was using the top or the front. It is not actually a camera marker or the starting position. So if I go back to the edit code side, you'll see that it goes back to where my actual camera was.
Okay.
So you want to know where you are, use the starting camera one, just use these for laying out the scene. But you can do whatever you want and create camera markers however you would want. So, you know, I could come fly up here, turn the camera down and create a marker that is from whatever direction that I would want it to be. And then remember, Command Z will undo stuff. So if I flew off, can do that. Use this one to bring it back, those types of things.
Can you put a camera marker in front of the door to look at the backs of the people?
Yeah, I mean, you can add as many camera markers as you like. Just use the camera controls on the bottom to set them up. And then, you know, use add camera to create whichever you would want. Naming is important. And I guess another thing that I did that was a little bit wrong in this sort of demo was Yeah, I should have renamed these to Astronaut 1 and Astronaut 2 or something like that. It gets a little confusing. The more of the same, because Adult Person 1 and Adult Person 2 is not a very good descriptor for me to remember who's who as I started programming. So something else you might want to consider. Well,
Okay,
thank you for joining me.
Okay, I have a copy of the book, Alice 3 Tips and Techniques by Wanda, Steve, and Don.
Okay.
You can't see it because I can't see me.
Yeah. I guess, is there a question in here? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this one up.
Wrap it. How do
Running for the first time, there is a QA session that's under a different Zoom.
Okay.
So
What
that
is
one
it?
will be, again, if you're on alice.org. However you found the Zoom for this one, it is probably there, but you can jump over to the workshop section and there's the weekly question and answer session. It has the Zoom info here for you to jump over.
Okay, let me just, what is it, 7-4? I can't read it because it's small.
Yeah. I would just go to alice.org.
No,
go to
I
resources.
don't have room on my screen. 755-047?
197.
197. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So with that, I am going to conclude our programming with Alice again. Go to that one. We can jump over to the QA Zoom one. I just want to start compiling this video so I can get it off so we can share it out. And I am happy to go slow through this one there, answer any other questions you might have. Otherwise, definitely join us next week for the one where we'll talk about the design process for Alice, show some other tips and tricks around creating a scene, those types of things. And then after that, the next weeks to follow, we'll get in a lot more of those control structures you saw on the bottom and some of the event programming. So a bunch of the parts we didn't get into in the code editor today will come in future lessons and definitely make it so you can make a lot more cool things. Thank you all for your time. Definitely share your worlds with us. I will also be putting up something soon that is very exciting about how you can take your Alice world, wrap it in a Unity player, and share it as your own standalone app. That should be being published later today on our site. So look for that one if you want to share your functioning worlds. Otherwise, have a great week, and I will talk to you next week.